us to? All right, Brett Pence is going to read our land acknowledgement.
Thank you. Wherever you may be, let us acknowledge that we are all on Indigenous land. Minnesota is located on the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples, the original stewards of this territory. We are committed to uplifting the name of these lands and the community members from these nations as we pursue a right path together. We acknowledge the trauma that is deeply embedded in the foundation of this country. The land we reside on came under the control of the United States through genocide, slavery, and ongoing occupation. We recognize the deep historical, spiritual, and personal trauma that has impacted Indigenous communities, communities of color, and immigrant communities. By offering this acknowledgement of trauma, we affirm the right of people to bring their whole selves and stories into this space, and we affirm our intention to promote healing, respect, and love.
Deep breath. Well, welcome everyone to our second of 10 Community Climate Resilience Network conversations. This is a series, Sam, you can move to the next slide. This is a series that we have put together over the next 10 months. We will be gathering on the third Tuesday of every month from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And our goal is to help all of you think about what it would look like to create a resilience hub in your place. So here's what we've got for going for tonight. The topic for tonight is relationships and how we build relationships, even in rocky times and especially in rocky times. And why it is that relationships are the center of creating vibrant and effective safe spaces and resilience hubs in our communities. So I'm going to introduce the topic. I'm going to tell you my own story and going to share a few conceptual ideas about how resilience hubs are going to help us get from here to there. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time with each other, breaking out into some small groups and talking about how it is that relationships and connections with other folks have made it possible for us to move forward in our work. At 7 o'clock, we're going to have Reverend Tyler Sitt, who is going to talk about his work building the new city church and figuring out how to be in a vibrant place in community in complicated and beautiful ways. We'll then we'll spend a half an hour with Tyler, hearing his story and engaging with his story. And then we'll turn to how we actually think about relationships as we plan for these resilience hubs. So we have Beth Remmes from Georgia Interfaith Power and Light, who will tell us a little bit about what they've done in Georgia to be creating some spaces there. And then she and I will have a conversation about the kinds of tools that we need to be developing in our places that will help us move forward. And we'll end essentially with an invitation to come back in March and to start your work of finding the people that you need to find in order to be effective in this journey. So now, Sam, I think we'll go without slides for a moment, and I'll let you know when we want to re-engage. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Julia Nurbin, and I'm the Executive Director of Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. And I've been doing this work here in this organization since 2011. And it's just a great joy to be watching the emerging and the changing climate movement as our circumstances change. And obviously, we're in a place in human history where things are really stressful right now. So you all are sitting with fears about a number of crazy things, but I want to just remind you that being in places that are difficult is something that many of us have done, and that social movements and movements towards local solidarity and care have been around us for a long time. So I wanted to talk to you about this time during the uprising. where I was able to be part of a group that really created a resilient network. So you all may know the restaurant Gandhi Mahal, and if you don't know it, there was a restaurant in Minneapolis, right off of Lake Street, provided wonderful Indian food, and Ruhel, the owner of that restaurant, was his goal in life was to create a vibrant and connected community. So next door to the restaurant, he had a community room. And Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light rented some space in that area to bring people together to make art and to have meetings. And it was a beautiful space of rich conversations and good food. But just a few months before George Floyd was murdered, of course, the COVID came, and it had sort of been quite quiet there. Um, and the space of was located just a couple of blocks from the third precinct, which ended up being sort of the epicenter of the uprising in Minneapolis. So there was an afternoon, and there had been a march, and there was a protest that had convened outside of this police precinct. Ruhel, of course, is in his restaurant, and he is cooking food for people, and he's bringing people out of the streets into a safe space. And at some point, it became clear that this office space that we rented was needed to be a medics spot. So I got a call, and folks asked me, would you come down and help the medics get set up and help with things that they needed? And so I remember driving over there, and there was tear gas in the air, and there was smoke, and it was nighttime, and so there was the lights coming through the smoke. And I remember sort of thinking to myself that this is a moment, it's an unbelievable moment. I'd never been in a war, but here I was in the midst of this sort of crazy spot. Um, I can remember the exact location of the woman who I drove home after she had been tear gassed. I was able to get in my car and drive her home. And every time I drive by that house, I can remember it. Um, so at some point during that evening, fires were spreading throughout the neighborhood, and it was clear that this was not going to be a safe space to be a medic's um, location. And so we had to move. And so people were really unclear about what to do because they didn't know where they could move in the midst of this chaos. Um, and it became clear that there was a church that was just 2 blocks away, Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. And it occurred to me that I knew how to reach Pastor Rasmussen, that I actually had the ability to call her up. I didn't reach her directly. I had to call a couple of other folks who are part of our network who were able to find her cell phone number, wake her up out of her bed and say, we need to open the door to this church. Can we use this just for the evening? And so within 20 minutes that had happened. It was just an incredible moment for me to think about how it was that knowing people who knew people and being in relationship in this neighborhood had created an opportunity to be able to open a safe space and to be able to respond to this crisis in a moment where people didn't believe there was a safe spot. Um, Holy Trinity then went on to really become a hub of activity around recovering from that uprising. And we went on at Minnesota IPL to connect, I think, 5 or 6 different congregations with medic communities around the Twin Cities who were able to help over the next few days. So I am imagining that you all have had experiences of being in the midst of a crisis. So maybe it was a medical crisis that you were involved with. Maybe it was on the highway. Maybe you were stranded. Maybe there was a fire. Um, it's thinking about how we respond in the midst of those most critical times can teach us a lot about who we are and what we are prepared for. Um, and what I'd love to do tonight is to think about how it is that those that we know has changed the course of our lives, especially when it comes to dealing with emergency. Okay. Um, Sam, do you want to turn those slides on? All right, so as you know, the topic of this webinar series is thinking about how resilience hubs can enhance the quality not only of everyday life, but also provide us an opportunity to plan for disasters. So as we talked about in the last webinar, there's 3 different phases of a resilience hub. One is the normal everyday phase, and we're hoping that that is like 95% of the time. During that time, people are planning for this disruption. They're helping to center community. They're building cultural connections. We are building the village. During a disruption, sometimes resilience hubs are able to offer safe shelter, resources, services, coordination. They're able to call up the person who has the key. Sometimes resilience hubs simply provide that communication. Other resilience hubs actually provide a spot where people can come and sleep. Vastly different ways of dealing with a disruption, but resilience hubs have a plan for how to deal with the disruption. And of course, the time after a disruption or a crisis is also critical. How are we going to help a community to rebuild and to move forward in strength and to plant the seeds of the community that they need to be in the future? So next slide. So we have proposed that there are 5 pillars of the work. One is to create programs and services, things that will be available to people every day of the week: health services, education, community building, um, communications. The next part of the work is figuring out, how do we get to know people? How do we communicate what the center does? How do we bring people in? How do we um, make sure that people know what this place, this resilience hub, is able to offer during an emergency? The next pillar of work is figuring out the operations. Who is the person who comes and unlocks the door during the critical moment? Who is it that will call the food distribution center, etc.? What does the building and the landscape look like? Is it energy efficient? Or is there lighting that doesn't take too much electricity? Do we have rain gardens? Do we have spaces where people can gather? What does it look like? And how is that building powered? Is it possible for that building to be powered in the midst of a power outage? Are there batteries to back it up? So next slide. I imagine you all are wondering, all sounds great, but how do we get here from here to there? Right now, maybe your community center has some wonderful programming, but you haven't thought about an emergency. Maybe you have been doing a lot of work on solar and battery backups, but you haven't been thinking about how to integrate that into a community response plan. So next slide. Luckily, we've got great models about how to plan our journey. And so what I want to do is tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we find our own stories and find the relationships that are going to move us forward so that we can start putting together the structures and the strategies for how to achieve the kind of resilience hub that we really imagine is possible in our place. So next slide. For those of you who have done the Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light Be the Spark program, maybe you remember this diagram. This comes from Marshall Gans at the Harvard leadership program. And he talks about how first we need to share to learn our own story, to tell our own story. And then we need to build relationships of people who have the same vision and are willing to work towards some of the same goals, but we need to be in relationship with those people. And it's only after that that we can really focus on creating the structures that are going to move us forward. Next slide. So I want to give us a moment. We're going to break into some groups, and I think, Buff, you're going to set these up for us. You'll be in groups of 3 or 4. And you're going to take about 8 minutes. And you're going to think about a time that because you were connected and in relationship with someone else, that it really made a difference. So I just told you a story of when knowing how to reach Pastor at Holy Trinity made all the difference during the midst of that crisis during the uprising. That's kind of a dramatic story. But it could be just that you had a connection with somebody who was able to help in the time that a loved one really needed something. But just think about a time where you were connected and it mattered. And I want you to share those stories, and then we'll bring those stories back into this room and think about how relationships and networks um, drive this work at the core. Buff, why don't you send us off?
You'll be automatically sent to a room. Just say yes when you're invited to join.
And you're going to get to meet somebody, and it's going to be awesome. And for those of you who are still in this room, those who are on iPhones, for example, happy to gather here or just to take a break. Actually, close this part of the evening, and I'm just absolutely delighted. I'm going to introduce Reverend Tyler Sitt, and I brought his book with us. I hope you all will please go check out this amazing story. It's called "Staying Awake: The Gospel for Changemakers," and I will say no more. I'll let Tyler do that. I introduced Tyler at the beginning of this session to say that he is, I think, a revolutionary change maker, and he's done that through his faith community. Of course, so much of that is about relationships. So we had a great conversation this morning, and I'm going to hand it to you, Tyler, to take it away.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Julia. It's so exciting to be with all of you. I've been looking forward to this forever. Also, just for good measure, I'll drop a link to my book in the chat if anyone wants to take a quick gander. Feel free. Goodness gracious. So, like Julia mentioned, my name is Tyler Sitt. I use he, him pronouns. I identify as gay and Chinese American, and I was born and raised in Minnesota. My parents met at the University of Minnesota at a disco dancing class. So I like to say that I owe my life to disco. Amen. Hallelujah. So so just a little bit of background story of New City Church. So I moved here in 2015 because a mentor, I'm from Minnesota, left for 10 years, lived in a whole bunch of places, came back. And a mentor of mine said, Tyler, you should plant a church because you think like an entrepreneur and you pray like a mystic. And that's all you need to plant a church, which, spoiler alert, that is not all you need to plant a church, but it got me in the door. Nonetheless, it was still something that was like, okay, maybe this is something that I could explore. Planting a church, of course, is starting a congregation kind of from scratch instead of working in an established congregation. So, with the blessing of the United Methodist Church, I created a proposal that said I was going to build a church that focuses on climate change because I come from obviously this is a passion area of mine, and I did some activism throughout seminary and all that stuff around climate change. And I thought a church that focuses on climate change, this is what we need. And so I did a prayer walk through every neighborhood in Minneapolis and kind of just asked God, like, God, what do you think about Minneapolis? What do you think about this neighborhood? What are these stores and these people and what I'm hearing telling me about what your dream is for the world? And so I fell in love with the Powderhorn neighborhood in Minneapolis. Do y'all know Powderhorn? It's so great. I just adore Powderhorn. So anyways, I was walking around and I met people at bus stops and said, I'm planting a church that focuses on climate change, and talked to people in coffee shops. And I Googled environmental justice Minneapolis and just kind of cold called people who are doing work in related areas. And slowly, I started getting a sense of like kind of where the neighborhood was and what was going on. But one of the things I encountered, I did so y'all know Powderhorn, it's super racially diverse, equal parts African-American and Latina, and there's significant populations of Somali and Ethiopian folks there in the north. In Phillips, there's a Native American community where the AIM movement like, was born. White folks, of course, and then just like a couple of Asians like me kind of sprinkled throughout. Super diverse. So anyways, I was pitching to these folks, like, I am thinking about a church that focuses on climate change. What do you think? And one woman told me, I care about climate change, but like my husband just got deported and I have to pick up a third job to take care of my kids. So you do the climate change thing and then I'm going to go do this. And I was like, that's like kind of breaking my brain, because obviously climate change has everything to do with immigration. Climate change has everything to do with stability and economic stability and all of that. But the language frame of what that evoked wasn't necessarily helpful for just this particular woman. And so I thought, okay, what are my non-negotiables in ministry? I care about it being multiracial. I care about it having to do with climate and the planet. I care about it being Jesus-y, because I'm in a United Methodist tradition. So like, I was going through my non-negotiables and I realized that talking about climate change wasn't necessarily one of my non-negotiables, but doing something about climate change was. And so I was like, okay, well, maybe we talk about this in a different way. And so I stopped saying, what about a church that focuses on climate change? And I started pitching it as an eco church, because I thought eco church sounded kind of sexy. That's interesting. Who's heard of an eco church? I don't know. I want to go. So I was talking to people about eco church, and I, like generating contacts, asking people like, who should I be talking to? Who's someone who is interested in these types of themes? And eventually I did a focus group with some of my African-American contacts and friends. And I said, okay, eco church, what do you think? And they said, how do we tell this to you gently? Eco church sounds bougie. It sounds expensive. It sounds like an eco toilet bowl cleaner that like cleans worse but costs more. That's what your church sounds like. And I was like, okay. So what are my non-negotiables? Like, is eco church one of my non-negotiables or not? And so it wasn't. So I kept listening, going to community events. I went to, do y'all remember when Alondra Cano was on the city council? So Alondra Cano held a neighborhood forum on gentrification. And all of a sudden, here in this room, it was in La Plaza Verde, right there on Lake Street. Here in this room, it was like standing room only in this major community space. And it was like super racially diverse. It was like all the people groups that I named in Powderhorn in one room talking to the city council member about gentrification. And slowly, from listening to people, I heard this story of like, in the 80s and 90s, y'all know this, but like in the 80s and 90s, Powderhorn had a lot of drugs and crime, and there was a lot of stuff going on, and a lot of families, especially like African-American and at that time, Mexican immigrant families, got together and made the neighborhood amazing. They put in a bike lane, they planted urban gardens, they shut down one of the 3 factories that was giving kids asthma. Like they like the Midtown Global Market, like they were doing like all these amazing things, but they were so amazing at making the neighborhood a vibrant place that the cost of living started going up, and literally the same families that built this neighborhood were getting kicked out to other neighborhoods. And so like the story that I heard again and again was like, I guess I'm too poor to live in a safe and green neighborhood. And it was like, okay, well, wait a second. Like, I care about climate change, and climate change is the topic of like, who deserves to live in this planet? And gentrification is the conversation of who deserves to live in this neighborhood. And actually, these are extremely related conversations because it has everything to do with green economy. It has everything to do with breathable air and good food and access to this. So I pulled a bunch of people together, riding the energy from this. I pulled a bunch of people together to do a Bible study on Revelation 21. And we looked at the story of this new city. I don't know if any of y'all read Revelation lately, but it's this gorgeous image of the city of God. It's like heaven coming down to earth. Heaven isn't people coming up, but heaven comes down to earth. And all tribes are welcomed in, and there's no more violence, and the whole earth is renewed. And we're like, well, wait a second. Gee whiz, this Bible story is like describing that heaven is the opposite of gentrification. It's like people being able to come in and the earth getting better. And, like this is what it means for us to like be in beloved community together. So that's how we became New City Church, from doing all of this listening. And so thanks for listening to all of that. I guess the reason why I tell this story is a couple of things. One, to highlight that generating contacts is like a major intentional thing. And I know that there's some folks who are like introverts on this call who are like, oh no, what is this pastor asking me to do? And I got a name, like, I'm not saying that you have to contact as many people as it takes to build a church, but there is like a certain amount of intentionally pressing into your networks and relationships to be able to connect with people. And I guess what I realize as I've been, I coach church planters, I do intersectional church planter training and lots of stuff like working with churches on how to think through their future and strategic planning. And something that I always ask people to identify is their ratio. So my ratio was if I make 25 contacts a week, 6 of those contacts will respond to my request to get coffee with them. If I make 25 contacts, 25 is just like, it's a person that I met who I know how to get in touch with. So I'm not talking like this huge elaborate thing. I'm saying like 25 contacts a week. 6 of them will get coffee with me. Of the 6 people that I get coffee with, 3 of them are going to come to church. And of the 3 people who come to church, 1 of them is going to stay at church. So if I needed 40 people in this community in order for this whole thing to work, then I needed to generate 1,000 contacts. And I know that like, if you're not used to some of that rhythm, that can sound like an intimidating number. But I just want to name that like, there's something really empowering to knowing your ratio. And by the way, the ratio is different for everyone based off of myriad factors. Like I had a colleague, Tori, who was like this single mom who could not churn out the same number of contacts that she had. So she was maybe doing like 5 or 10 contacts a week, but her ratio was, she would like 90% of the people Tori talks to, like want to come back and talk to Tori again, so everyone's ratio is different. But what I'm trying to say is like, my hope for you is that you're talking to enough people that it's not just your closest friends that are going to say yes to you, but that you're talking to people who are going to say no. And I just want to speak a word of encouragement. Like every no that you receive means that you are 1 closer to getting to your ratio of the person who's going to stick around and do your thing. So like, yeah, if my ratio is 25 to 6 to 3 to 1, and I only generated 10 contacts that week and all of them were no's, that would be pretty demoralizing. But if I know that the goal is 25 contacts to 1, then maybe that can be some inspiration. So my hope for you as you're building connections and teams is that in whatever socially accessible way that you like, you're able to kind of make these contacts, track them, and then starting to do the beautiful work of weaving people together. Okay, so that's a little bit of my connection story. I think it would make sense, Julia, if you wanted to respond, or I can kind of double click into any of this, but yeah.
Beautiful. Folks, if you have questions for Tyler, if you would put them in the chat, I should have invited you to do that earlier, but feel free to put some questions in the chat. But I'm gonna just pull some strings for a minute. So I'm really excited about this. You were planting a church, and we're not talking about planting churches. We're talking about planting resilience hubs. One of the things about resilience hubs is that they involve, I'm thinking about a congregation or even a community center that's not specifically a house of worship, but something that is in a community, right? So its goal is to not just be useful to the people who happen to be signed up already to, be in that faith community, for example. We want to create institutions that are available to the people in the broader community. So I'm wondering if you might sort of riff on this idea of how a resilience hub might be both similar and different. And then it's one thing to have a ratio of like who will come and stay at church, right? What were some of the things that were maybe not engaging people to come to a service, but instead to be engaged in a committee or
Yeah.
like the work of these resilience hubs and of a vibrant church is being part of the body of that institution. So what are the things that work to draw
that.
people in and keep them?
Ooh, I love that. Okay, so I would say a couple things. One is I want to name in my pre-planting season, I had like a season where I was like, I'm pounding the pavement and doing this. Nowadays, I'm like 9 years into ministry, I think. I'm not generating 25 contacts a week while pastoring and doing things. But so like the way that I sometimes encourage people to think about it is like, what do you need to get to a cruising altitude so that when you're paying attention to these other projects, like it can feel like you're buttressed by the number of contacts that you have. If you have 3 people in a room and then one of them gets COVID and 2 of them have a wedding that weekend, then you have 0, so it's like just trying to think like, it doesn't have to be 40 people. It could be 10 people. It could be 12 people, but what is the core that's needed to be like at a cruising altitude? That I think is similar because there will always be kind of rings of people where like core folks who are going to, do y'all know about like chicken and pigs, that whole business metaphor? So there was like, okay, maybe this is not worth it, but there was a chicken. One day there was a chicken walking down the street with a pig, and they were thinking about opening up a restaurant. And the chicken said, well, I'm thinking we should serve bacon. And the pig said, well, I'm thinking we should serve eggs. But wait, what did you say about the bacon? And the point is like, there are some folks who are chickens, which means that they're contributing out of their abundance. Like when they have extra, they'll give it to you. And then there are some folks who are pigs who are like, my life is this. Like I'm contributing from a place of calling and vocation. And like the goal is to have enough people in the latter category so that you have an orbit of people in the chicken category. I don't know if that metaphor was worth it, but okay. So the difference though, as far as entire community benefit is, well, I would even say like, there are lots of folks that I talk to about New City Church who were like, I don't want to step 1 foot in your church or have anything to do with your church. But I think that some of the things that you're describing are cool. So like, I have like a separate list for folks who are like kind of in that orbit. And whenever I have an event that's kind of relevant to some of the interests they name, I try to pull from that. But whether it's whether you call it a resilience hub or maybe you pivot some of the language to match the context or whatever, like there has to be some through line that's pulling people, some story that's captivating people to be part of this. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna dig in a little bit deeper. So think about a team within New City, or like you were obviously, once you have formed a relationship with people, you're pushing people into circles where they're in relationship with each other.
Mm-hmm.
What has really been glue that causes those teams to coalesce in a way that makes it possible to do the work together?
Yes. So I kind of Julia's helping me remember the prep conversation that we had. So I kind of saw the first stage as like, I'm starting something, and so I'm just generating a lot of contexts that all kind of like, I'm like the hub of a wheel. But once I got to a cruising altitude, my job was to turn around and have people have relationships with each other. And so the way to do that was certainly training people in one-on-ones, which I understand is going to be something that you all talk about. Love asking people to get coffee, to share stories about purpose and meaning and values. Love, love, love uncovering those stories. Sometimes there are people who don't want to, who can't navigate the social intensity of going on a one-on-one with a stranger. So I've also done things where it's like, we're going to go see a show at the Guthrie. And while we're in the while we're like early and waiting for the show to start, we're going to have the same conversations as we would have at a coffee place. But now we're both looking at the same thing instead of looking at each other. And that intensity is decreased. Going on field trips together, like talking in the car. Like I think a lot of my work is about giving permission for people to socially engage with each other in a way that wouldn't be easily replicated in the broader society.
Beautiful. I have a question from Jules. They're curious to hear more about the language shifting, code switching that you talked about, particularly between different types of beliefs. So they say,
Yeah.
yeah. And I before you answer, I just want to say, you know, Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, multi-faith focus.
Yes.
We have folks in Jewish congregations and Muslim congregations. We have folks who are put together circles of spiritual practice that are unaffiliated with an official institution. And we have folks who are really excited about building relationships with people in their neighborhoods in such a way that they can create a safe and productive space. So lots of different folks, but this question about code switching, we're all in complex places with complex political dynamics and languages, and what do you think of that?
So this is where I go back to the list of non-negotiables. So for me, it's like, hey, if you're, and translate this to apply to your own situation. But for me, it's like, if you're going to be working with Tyler Sitt, then he's probably going to be talking about Jesus sometimes. And you don't have to believe in Jesus, but Tyler Sitt is going to be talking about Jesus sometimes. So I kind of see it more like informed consent. Like I'm just showing people up front, like this is kind of what you're going to be dealing with if you want to be in this type of collaboration or partnership. And if you don't want that, like part of my commitment to emotional safety is like, I will still support you and be gracious to you and reach out to you for relevant things that might interest you if you don't want to be on the Jesus thing. Like that's totally, like we're good, all things are good, but the nature of this project has these 5 non-negotiables, and that's kind of part, like if someone comes to your resilience hub and they're like, what if it was like a oil refinery? I imagine some of you would be like, well, gee whiz, like there's some non-negotiables that contradicts, and maybe this isn't a good fit. So I think I just believe in telling people those up front so that they can have informed consent. And similar, I see that Buff asked a question about code switching and the term resilience. I don't know, like all of you are in like these microcosms of networks and circles where words mean different things. So like, I can't say for sure, but just ask people. What are some of the good questions to ask when people, so I always ask questions, first of all, just showing like, I care about you as a person before I'm pitching you on anything. So like, how did you get to Minnesota? What led you to the decisions that matter to you? Like, what is it like to be you right now? What matters to you? And then I share kind of my versions. And then if it makes, like, based off of those 2 conversations, I start naming like relevant parts of the project. Yeah.
Beautiful. Tyler, you earlier today were talking about you actually are also a pastor of a church in Northeast Minneapolis, which has a very different sort of vibe than New City.
Yeah.
And you were just talking about how sometimes the kinds of communication tools that work in one place don't work in another. And I love that story.
Oh, sure. Yes. So in 2022, New City launched a second site in Northeast Minneapolis. So Northeast United Methodist Church was an established congregation that was like, we are ready to try something totally different. So they like very sacrificially, I would say, like put all of their regular rituals and traditions and kind of stuff on hold, invited in New City. And now, like New City shares sermon series, we share small groups. I preach at Northeast, which is where I am now at 10, go to New City at 11:30. So New City is more racially diverse and younger. And Northeast has, I mean, isn't 100% white, like certainly has people of color, but is certainly whiter and older on average. And as I'm trying to set people up to be in circles with each other, the tactics are really significantly different, but the philosophy is the same. So the philosophy is like, I'm trying to set up people to bless each other well. But like at New City, we launched Circle, which is like a social platform that lives on our website that like people can log in and say, who wants to grab tacos on Friday or come to my comedy show or whatever. And then, and they socialize with each other in that way. Northeast folks aren't as tech forward, you might say, but I'll tell you what, Northeast folks read every word in our newsletter and they check in on each other actually like better than New City folks. So like they're calling each other and kind of doing, so I guess like, do you see how the underlying principle is like, I'm trying to create a sense of safety and trust so that people can support each other in meaningful ways while also always creating the emotional safety of like, they can opt out if they don't want to.
Beautiful. So Tyler, you talked a little bit about this formation of a network, and I know there's we talk about this a lot in Be the Spark. There's a snowflake model where if you are in the center and maybe you've got a core team in your congregation, and I don't know what project you're trying to do, but actually you have to rely on all these people around your core circle, and then each of those folks have relationships outside of those. And so really when something big happens, what you need to be able to do is to activate that core team, to activate the first network, like to activate the larger sort of community or whatever it is. I don't know if there's an example of how that has worked in your work or yeah.
Oh yeah, goodness. So I mean, just to go back to the uprisings, because it's such a, we learned so much in such a small amount of time, but it's like, we launched Circle. No, we were still on Facebook groups at that time. Facebook group. I'm not a huge fan of those, but anyways, it was like the amount of resourcing that happened in such a small amount of time is like, it like changed my understanding of what it means to be a human being. Like people were like, I need Spanish translation for my neighbors to tell that, to explain the thing that the FBI just sent out. Like, okay, we're making this happen. Like I need childcare because we just found piece of wood soaked in gasoline that we think the arsonists are going to use as a fire, like just like major looking out for each other. But I think what really felt exciting to me is like people knew to ask me for things that are like only a pastor of a church can give permission to do, like putting our name on in journalistic articles or that kind of thing. But otherwise people were running and kind of like ministering in their areas. And it just felt like the snowflake did it. Like it was one of the first times where I really felt like the snowflake really doesn't matter. It doesn't depend on the center of the snowflake anymore, because the snowflake is fractaling out and doing their own snowflaking. And that just is like an incredible feeling in the midst of a really terrible current event.
Beautiful.
Great.
Right. I'm just looking to see. So Tyler, can you describe what an average week working at New City Church involves in terms of climate issues?
Oh, sure. Well, and I didn't even get to this one, but so New City used to have an urban agriculture program. I don't know if you remember those days, Julia, but we used to have a going around to people's yards and planting a permaculture urban agriculture thing. And it was successful by every metric that grant makers care about, like number of pounds delivered of food and neighbors engaged and all that stuff. But it wasn't, one of our internal non-negotiables was that people from the neighborhood after we launch it, that people who live in the neighborhood take the program themselves and run with it. And that wasn't happening. So we did another round of listening, and we identified that like the neighbors of the church who we thought would be amazing leaders for this experienced instances of racialized trauma in their lives that were deeply unprocessed and like preventing them from meeting basic functions in their lives, much less taking on an extra ministry project. So we totally shifted this otherwise successful urban agriculture program into the Incarnation Fund, which supports BIPOC folks in accessing therapy, nature-based retreats, and spiritual direction led by people of color. And so I say this to say, like as another example of environmentalism and climate change activism at New City is like, we're sending people of color on retreats led by people of color out in nature. And like part of our theory of change is when folks realize or remember that exposure to nature is essential to our own healing of like of our own internal journey, that will create a basis of environmentalism that drives from like a deep place of healing. So like, yeah, that's that kind of like code switching language frameworking again, where it's like, that's most of the time when people think of climate change work, they don't think of therapy. But here we are listening to our community and seeing like, that's actually kind of like exactly what climate change works look like. We've also changed after Walker Church graciously transferred their building to New City Church, and we became kind of the owners of the church, that we changed the building to be the New City Center for Healing Justice. And there are lots of environmental groups that meet out of that building now. So that's kind of part of it as well.
Beautiful. I am going to transition us to the next part of our evening. Tyler, this has been super exciting, and you'll be on for the next 28 minutes or something like that. And so folks, feel free to ask Tyler questions in the chat, and if there's something that's burning at the end, we'll come back to it. Sam, I'm wondering if you can put those slides back up. All right. I'm going to be totally honest. This has been a month of searching for the perfect formula for the MNIPL team. And every time we think we're narrowing in on a perfect formula, it becomes clear that there are 100 good ways to create a successful resilience hub. So we're going to share a few ideas about pathways through which you can start to engage in this work. They are places to start. I've chosen the little boxes, the checklist, right? And hopefully some of these will map on what you've heard from Tyler. So I want to say, as you first start out on this journey, your community has tremendous assets. You are already doing things that will make you a resilience hub. But we think that a resilience hub needs to mean something. And what one of the core components of being a resilience hub is that you have a core team that is committed to this concept of creating this hub. And so here's a few things that you can do as you start out. Find your why. What are the non-negotiables that Tyler was talking about in the context of who you are? You're going to need to figure out who are the people that are going to create the core team. So maybe you're going to need to figure out the ratio. If I talk to, 20 people in my congregation, I might find 3 people who would be interested in working on this with me. That would be really exciting, but I may need to go outside of the church in the neighborhood and say, will you come in and help us with this and create a core team? Part of figuring out what that core team is also getting permission. And sometimes that can be really tricky in communities of faith. What is it that the institution has sort of blessed or made official? How do you make sure that this work that you're doing is something that's in the context of what those who have leadership in that institution are sharing that vision? You're going to map the assets and the vulnerabilities like Tyler did. It may mean walking the neighborhood. It may mean getting to know the neighbors. It may mean thinking about what you have in your building, who already uses it, where is it underutilized? You're going to need to establish some shorter term goals. And I think it's so important to think about resilience hubs as being there's going to be, again, hundreds of different ways that this plays out. You may be, I'm thinking about you, Shoto, out there in a rural area without a physical building. But you've put together a core team and you have decided that you're going to work in conjunction with somebody who has a storefront that you don't own. Or maybe you're gonna, maybe the shorter term goal is just to build a list of people who care about this and establish a quarterly gathering for them. That could be your goal. So you're gonna wanna establish a short term goal that is, that helps you to think about that bigger why and the vision, but at the same time is gonna work so that people don't feel burned out and used up. Of course, you're going to then need to go and grow the team. And you're going to need to be thinking about what are the community networks? Who are the people, like in Tyler's context, that are never going to go to church, but are the people that this institution is ultimately in relationship with in order to grow a community that will be vibrant and respond to climate change and racial injustice in the way that you have identified in your why. So Sam, next slide. Again, core team within a community or a congregation. And then what is the broader community? What are their fears? Do you know who these folks are that you are living in and amongst and with? Do they already know each other? Maybe your congregation is out of sync with that particular neighborhood. What's already happening there? Essential questions. Okay, next slide. And then as you think about doing asset mapping, you're going to be wanting to think about not just individual phone numbers, but the institutions in that community. Are there folks in the city of St. Paul who have already figured out how to respond to a power outage or a heat event or something like that? What's their conversation? Can you send somebody from your team to that emergency preparedness meeting in the county or in the city? Who has social license? So this, when I say power here, I'm not talking about solar power. I'm talking about, who has influence or the ability to be helping people to connect with you. How do you get permission? What's the knowledge that you have? What's the knowledge that you need to be collecting? I'll be sending these slides out. This is a set of ideas that you can go down the list or you can just sort of absorb it. Tyler has talked about a lot of these. Next slide. Oh, I'm so delighted. So Beth has been struggling with so many of these things, just as we have been at Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. Georgia is investing in creating a vibrant network of resilience hubs in that state. And while some of the issues that you deal with are slightly different, many of them are quite similar. And so I'm going to let you take it away, Beth.
All right. All right. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm just going to start. Tyler, thank you so much. I love that you took prayer walks through the neighborhoods. Like, I love that so much. And I think a few things that rose out of what you're saying that applies to my work and with resilience hubs. First of all, that it's a holistic, right? You went in thinking, oh, it's going to be about climate change, and you heard everything people are dealing with. And I think that's a really good lesson for resilience hubs. So we're not going to just center the disruption. So I live in coastal Georgia, so resilience hubs around me probably are hurricane related-ish, but not centering that, because as you talked about, if you really dig deeper into climate change or the inequities, why some people can respond more easily than others, like those are deeply rooted systems in our country. And so being able to think about those in a holistic way and not make it about one particular thing and leaving that open is really important. And to that point, like that's where the community engagement piece comes in. So I don't need to be an expert on all the reasons why, right? Like that's why we do the community engagements. In your case, it looks like going out and asking all of those questions and talking with people. How we're thinking of it,
Do you want
in a-
the slides?
we could do that. Yeah. I don't even know there, so it'll be a surprise. I
awesome.
saw them at some
Right.
point, but and I guess I'll just say too, while we're pulling those up, is oh, here we go. Could we be? Okay, great. Yeah, so this is kind of some of the steps. But again, I just want to say, Tyler, thank you like for centering like how holistic these issues are, the importance of community engagement. And then I'll just say too, I'm going to put this in the chat. It's something that I have when I do the presentations, but just how important social cohesion is more than anything else, more than the size of your building or the location of your building, or it's building these relationships. There's a number of studies out there. One pretty well-known one was the fire in Chicago. It wasn't necessarily the most resourced communities who fared the best. It was the neighbors who knew each other, knew to check on each other, knew, where to get help and who to talk to. So again, there's multiple studies, just how important social cohesion is. So thank you for lifting all of those up. And I think that is a great thing to kind of focus on as we talk about resilience hubs. I'll just kind of tell you our strategy. And again, this is new, like we are figuring it out too as we go along. But it's a combination of my studies on this, and I work with the Resilience Network in Glenn County, so kind of pulling from those experiences. What we have done, because we have had disruptions here, two this year in my town, I looked to which faith communities were already responding, what faith communities were already acting as a distribution center or a shelter or an evacuation site, and seeing what worked, kind of just documenting it, seeing what worked, what didn't work, as a study, as doing this work, so that when we have maybe a little more formal program, we can say, hey, I noticed you are already doing this in some capacity. Is this something you'd be interested in partnering with us on? We can help you. Now, Interfaith Power and Light, like we are so strong in our energy savings, our audits and our retrofits, and also our solar programs. So we can help lend that expertise and our programmings to them that would make them more resilient in a power sense. And those savings that they get from those programs could also help fund their ministry or possibly these resilience hubs. So go in at that level of trust, know it's something that we do really well, and say, how can we also help you do the outreach that you're currently doing, and how can we maybe do it better? The core team, which Julia mentioned too, obviously you need to have the leadership on board and the staff, because if the staff doesn't want to do it, it's probably not going to happen. So it's really important to start there, and maybe just some ideas of what the time expectations could look like. And it will depend on whether they want to be a distribution or a walk-in or a shelter. It's going to vary on what type they choose. And again, these places are only in disruption mode, like hopefully less than 1% of the year. But those services and programs will happen throughout the year. And for us, we're targeting quarterly, so for a year, getting out the calendar. Can we fit those in? Again, making sure the staff and leadership is on board with something like that. And then communicating it to the congregation. This is something your leaders would like to do. And maybe if you have a green team member who was helping in this discernment process initially, they could kind of be that bridge between leadership and the congregation as to why it's important. But giving them a chance to ask questions, being as transparent as possible of what the expectations are, what they are not. And then, if there's excitement around it, great. Maybe we have some new volunteers. And that's where that hub team would come in. The community mapping and conversations, like thinking of it as spheres of engagement. So you have like the leadership staff, you have the congregation, and then you have the wider community. So so you open it up, say, we're going to have a community meeting. We would like to offer some programming this year that would help build community resilience, and we would love your input. What that could look like, there are some surveys. I will try to put the link in the chat before we log off. Otherwise, I'll send it to Julia. But you could make your own survey. You could tailor surveys that are out there. But just as Julia was saying, that asset and vulnerabilities sort of survey, because you don't want to start meeting off with what are all the things that are wrong. Like that is not good for morale. And also, it's really important to try to build on the strengths that already exist. It's also a great reminder, as we've been talking about all night, we don't need to know the answers. Like we do not need to be the experts. We are asking the community. So what I envision and what this has actually looked like in Glynn County when we've done the survey. We had different categories, whether it was economy, food, health, transportation. People break up into different areas, talk about it, and then come up with a list. So again, we want to be as transparent and communicative as possible. So when we have this program with the community, we are really specific. This is what the faith-based community would like to offer. Part of this offering is programming. Tonight, we would like to talk about what programming you would like. So again, the survey might cover some of these topics. It might be health, it might be probably economy, food, things like that. So then each of those focus groups will talk about the brainstorm, they'll write down the things that they feel like they would really love to see. There would be they would, at the end of maybe 15 minutes or so, they would each stand up and say, this is what we talked about. It would be on like a big poster board. Everyone would have like 4 stickies and they'd get to vote of all the things that were posted, of the things that resonated the most for them and, across the board. And then from there, that's how we would start to kind of make a list of possible programs that would be, again, set up by the office, and we would help them find the experts. Just for example, I went to a great faith and mental health meeting this weekend, which doesn't sound like it's connected to Interfaith Power and Light, but it is, because if we, one of the things that come up is like, we want some more tools or access or ways to, helping someone in crisis. Like now I know people that I can suggest to run a workshop. And again, 4 times a year, I feel like is a reasonable goal. And again, it speaks to that social cohesion piece. And also, don't turn your calendar upside down. You already offer probably Wednesday night dinners, choir practice. Yes, we are doing this as faith-based organizations because we're feeling called to serve, but it could really be a win-win. Like this is a way. I know some places after COVID, it's been hard getting people back on Sundays. This is a way, like maybe they're there and they see something posted and think, oh, maybe I'd like to try that. So you don't, again, you don't have to turn your organization into all resilience all the time. It's just that it becomes part of your programming, and hopefully people might feel welcome or want to join something else that you're doing. And then I do anticipate, on a yearly basis, kind of sending out surveys. What did you like? What didn't you like? And maybe having another community meeting about, okay, well, what's bubbling up this year? And, I was listening to something actually in the car on the way here. you just really never know. Like, so it might start out programs, but it might turn into like that people have really gotten to know each other. They've really gotten to know the community needs and what they want. And now, like, hey, you know what? Actually, some after school tutoring would be really helpful for this community. I don't think that's a place where we're going to start, but it could be a place where we end up. What I was just listening to on the way, there is a woman, it's called Spencer Street Folk School. And again, it was like one of those kitchen table conversations, like, how do I get to know people? What does this look like? And then they ended up, over the years, it emerged into like sharing resources and sharing knowledge. So you don't have to know, you don't have to have all the answers going in, but just being open and being transparent and honest and open to feedback. That's how living systems work, right? And seeing what emerges. So weird
Beth,
seeing all of you.
one of the things that has, I think Tyler, Sam, you can turn the slides off now. One of the things that has been exciting for me about learning more about how you guys have been working in Georgia has been seeing that you have created things in such a way that it is something that is bite size is maybe the wrong word. But sometimes we see these examples of resilience hubs. And they're like these huge, city-run hubs, and they've got, enough space to house the entire neighborhood, and so they're doing this, huge lift in the community, which we do need those sorts of centers. But our vision at MNIPL is that we need 10,000 little tiny community-based resilience hubs that are probably networked with each other, who have good information and phone numbers and relationships, and maybe a battery and a solar array so that we can make sure to be an island in the midst of a storm. I mean, there's so much that can be done. But that doesn't mean that we have to, do all of the things. So one thing I'm wondering if you can describe is you said that there's 4 ways that somebody can be responding to an emergency evacuation, right? A congregation. And I think that what you said is that people can be, a congregation can just simply be a distribution center, or it can be a walk-in place where people can get information and be there during the day, or it can be an evacuation site, which is a whole nother level of complication, or it can be an overnight shelter. And that you don't have to be all those things. You can just do one piece, and then you can be transparent with folks about what it is that you're able to create. So I don't know if you have any stories related to, how a community might figure out, where can they get started? What little piece can they bite off?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's how we're working on it and thinking about it in Georgia. I'm sure there's many other ways to think about it, but that's kind of how we're thinking about the different kind of levels of engagement. When we were talking earlier, I said something and I'm like hoping I remember it how I said it, but I know there is a lot of uncertainty right now about funding. Like, is there going to be funding for our solar programs, and what will that look like? And there can be the hesitancy, like it can be like, okay, well, maybe now's not the time. But I actually think that really means that it absolutely is the time. Great if we can do all the infrastructure and again build off what IPL does well with the energy and the solar. Great. If we can do it, great. But the programming and the social cohesion is so important. I saw somewhere earlier in the chat when you were talking about a community center, someone's like, oh, I missed that place. I love that place. Like, faith communities already do that so well for your group. Like imagine opening up that circle and finding ways to engage the wider community and be that. We've talked a lot about it in Georgia IPL, but like that idea that we're a place of refugia, not just refuge, but refugia. Like we have like new things can sprout because we are in community together. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
There's a great question from Deborah, and I think we'll actually close on this question. And I'd love to, if you had some thoughts on this, Tyler, I'd love to hear it, but I'll read it out loud and I'll give a short response myself. So Deborah says, we're already working on growing emergency preparedness and resilience team, but with the fear of ICE amongst us, amongst other things right now. How can our neighborhood association and board, mostly white, engage and gain trust better with our BIPOC neighbors so that they can have a seat at the table in the planning? I mean, first of all, I think that, you know, the fear that people in our communities are feeling right now it's an element in many rooms. And so I guess what I would say, Deborah and everybody, is, again, you can only start with who you are and where you are. And so it may mean that the dream that you have of being exactly that place is not going to be fully realized, but maybe what you do is you know, get involved in something that they have asked for, you know, neighborhood support. And that's the way that you get to know people personally. Because again, you know, part of the reason that we wanted people to think about, when did you know somebody and that connection really mattered? So often those connections are very personal. And so, Tyler, I don't know if you have a thought on that question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've just kind of piggybacking off of this. I think in many instances there are already organizations doing already immigrant-led organizations and efforts that are doing really great work. And so I think that there's a posture of humility that can come of like, well, maybe we don't need to make it our thing if we're supporting, you know, maybe we can co-sign on other kind of stuff. Not that you're saying that, implying that in your question, but just that's something that comes to mind. Two is, it kind of feels like another ratio, like how many contacts do I need to have before I contact someone who is like in church planting, we call them a person of peace. So it's like someone who's like, can meaningfully connect with me and meaningfully connect with the immigrant community, and then kind of serve as the person who goes between the two. And yeah, it's not going to be fewer than 5, that's for sure. So like there's a certain intentionality around it.
Beautiful. All right. Well, I just want to really express my gratitude for all of your participation tonight and for coming back for number 2. In March, actually, Sam, throw up that very last slide in the deck. In March, we're gathering again, March 18th. And we would love to have you put that on your calendar. We're going to continue the journey. In March, we're going to talk about, we're going to talk a little bit more about actual structure and meeting norms and how to do asset maps and some of the nuts and bolts, and some other things that emerge in the next month as we make these plans. We are also going to be launching what we are going to call the Community of Practice in the summer of 2025. We're hoping to recruit 10 different hopeful resilience hubs, folks who are starting down that path to be in community with each other and with us as they try things out. So together we'll be figuring out, wow, if we really want to do a battery, where's the funding come from? We'll be asking questions about, you know, wow, I went and I thought my ratio was 1 to 5, but it turns out I just met 20 people and they're not interested, and we can workshop that together. So that's going to be a beautiful community. There's going to be an application process, so we're making sure that there's sort of a balance of different sizes and intentionalities around the work, but it's going to be great, and we hope that you'll join us. We would love to invite you to come and speak to our community. We would love it if you invited us to come and speak to your community. We can do a basic, what is a resilience hub, and get people excited. Maybe we can help to sort of be a little bit of a catalyst to your conversations. And then, of course, your homework is that we're sending you out to have the conversation. Would becoming a resilience hub help you to be the institution you're dreaming of? And if it is, how can we be in community together? I realize I just did that backwards. So thank you all for coming. It's been a wonderful, wonderful night, and we'll see you in a month.